here. Amen. All right, so we are continuing this sermon series called Rise and Fall. We've been going through 1st, 2nd Samuel, looking at the rise and fall of the first two kings, and this is a big one. This story may not be as well known as David and Goliath, but pretty much I think most people in the cultural zeitgeist know about the story of David and Bathsheba. I think it's just kind of one of those known stories that's just kind of out there because we're all like, ugh, like that's not good. It's not good what's happened there. So to start off this sermon, I want to say something about our faith, right? The center of our faith, like the midst of it, like what's in the core of us in our faith is that God came as his only begotten Son, Jesus, and he died and rose again. That is our faith. That is it. That there is nothing else attached to it than that. That it is that faith in that Jesus did that. That's our saving grace. That Jesus died and rose again. So if we want faith, we look to that point. If we want salvation, we look to that point of Jesus dying and rising again. Now, our sinful side, I think, often says that's too easy. I got to make it harder than that. I need to make sure that I endure enough of the pastor's sermons so that Jesus will smile down on me. He's like, you have had a difficult road, good and faithful servant. Come into the promised land, right? Like that's like we do that, or we're like, I need to believe these certain things. I need to trust these certain things. I need to think these people are outside, these people are in. I need to judge these people or do these things over here. We put all of these limits on salvation around it. But the truth of the matter is that we wipe it all clean, that it is that Jesus died and rose again. The reason why I am making such a big point to this is because that is what this story is about. And listen, this story has changed in me in the last 6 months. I could say, actually, I think we did this, 6 weeks ago in Bible study? Something like that. This story changed when we went through it for Bible study, because those of you who were in Bible study, and when we were talking about David and Bathsheba, we found something at the end of this that I didn't know was there. And so when we talk about rise and fall, we saw the rise of King Saul, right? We saw his rise and we saw his fall come down, right? And we've seen David rise. And in my mind, with the story of David and Bathsheba, and we're going to get into the story here in a little bit, but he comes up and yes, it's like, oh no, like he commits adultery. That's terrible. Like, and over there, he's like begins to fall. And then like, oh, but he confesses his sins and God forgives him of all of his sins. And then it kind of stays up. This was how I always viewed that story. That's not the story in the Bible. And that's difficult. That's difficult. So let's get into the story and see what it's actually saying to us. Because what we see in the fall of David, there's 3 weeks left, right? 3 weeks left in this sermon series. We have this one next week, which it better be good, Ed. It better be good. Yeah. Like that's the but we have next week, and then we have the week afterwards, right? Where we wrap it all up, and it's not there's really nothing that is triumphant. There's really nothing that's triumphant, and that's a problem because a lot of times in the Christian faith of today, we want like the triumphant faith. We're like, yes, God, like just smite my enemies and all, like all those things, like church triumphant type of stuff. And it's just not It's just not there. It's not in this story. So let's get into the story and see what's going on here. So David, last week we talked about there's this Davidic promise that God gives David. And he says that your line, David, is going to you, the kingly line, that Messiah line is going to come through your people. It isn't always going to be easy. And says he talks about how he's going to have to discipline some of David's children, even David himself, as we see in this story. But it doesn't always go well. But he always says this to David: remember where you came from, David. Remember where you came from. Remember that you were once a shepherd, that you watched over the sheep. And this is how God says this is what the kingship of Israel is like, is that God's people, they are like the sheep, and the king isn't someone that just rules over them. The king isn't someone who uses the people to do whatever he wants of them, that I am king, I can do whatever I would like to you. No, the king is who walks behind them and lifts them up, and when the sheep find themselves in trouble, saves the sheep. David has kind of been that way his whole kingship until today. He's been unifying the kingdom. He's been bringing all these things in, and then suddenly the air changes. Suddenly something changes about the whole thing. I don't know about how you guys feel about stuff, but I've crashed on my bicycle twice in my life. It's more than that, but I've had to have surgery twice because of bicycle crashes. One is my wrist, and I still have a nice scar on that one. Because of this one, I had to have a cast on from August to December. Yeah, right? And you know what color my cast was? Who wants to guess? What color was my cast? Pink. Bright pink. I was a youth leader at the time, and pink was like the punk rock color at that time. And when the nurse came over and they took off my after surgery cast, I could tell that there was nothing connected in this general area, and it was just kind of flopping around. And she goes, "What color do you want?" And she started listing all the colors in a very bubbly way, and I went, "I don't care, pink." Like that's just because over there. Because I thought it would be like a deep color. And when it was still wet, it was a very deep, cool shade of pink. It dried into the most Barbie pink you have ever seen. And my friends that went to college with me still talk about my pink cast. Because my cast, I had a thumbs up the whole time. All that stuff. I'll have to show you guys some pictures of some. I should have put some up here. But because of that, and I crashed my bicycle when I was in Arkansas for my shoulder, I can tell when the winds change, right? When all those things change around us, like my arm will hurt, my shoulder will hurt. It was like, ooh, the weather's about to be different, right? It's about to rain. I can feel it in here, right? Suddenly that moment happens in our story today. And suddenly that moment happens. So David is doing all these things. He's going off to war. He's doing all the things kings do. Then we get the beginning of chapter 11. It says, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, what's the expectation? It's like, let's go off to war, y'all. But it's saying what the expectation is. David sent his general Joab, and he didn't go. He remained in Jerusalem. The story is telling you already that David isn't where he's supposed to be. And then one evening, David got up and he walked around on his roof, because that's one of the cool places to be in Port St. Lucie, especially this time of year, is on top of your roof. It's a nice place, right? So he was on his roof looking around, and he saw a woman bathing, and she was very beautiful. Now there's a couple things that you need to understand why she was bathing. The reason why is that every 28 days, according to Old Testament law, ladies, you had to do a ritual purification because you got to make Jesus smile, I guess, right? It was just part of being purified again. It was just part of that. So she was doing this. What does that tell us? Is that she was definitely not pregnant before this. That's what that tells us. She was definitely not pregnant. Because you know what people would do? Like we already see it in politics today. People will have like a president that they love, and no matter what happens, they're like, that person can do no wrong, right? The authors knew that this would happen with David. There's no getting of David getting out of this, right? There's nothing that could get David out of this. And so David sees this woman bathing. Here's a photograph of the event. And he sees her and brings her into his bed. And then, it seems like everything's all innocent, but just like some of my friends when I was in high school, it's like, oh man, I'm pregnant, right? That never happened to me. Probably because I didn't have any girlfriends in high school, but at least that's what we'll say, right? So like that's like all of a sudden she's pregnant. Oh man, like what's going to happen, right? And so David, he has an opportunity to own it, and he doesn't. And he's like, let's cover this up. Let's be sneaky. I've been watching General Hospital for 30 years now. Like, I know all the storylines. And he's like, let's go get her husband and bring him back, right? Like, so he goes to the front lines, again, where David should have been this whole time, goes and gets her husband, Uriah. And I always grew up thinking Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, was like a soldier, something like that, just like a general soldier. No, he's like a colonel. He's like a dude, like someone that's in charge of people. And he brings Uriah back, and under the guise of that Uriah is going to give a report to how the battles are going to the king, right? Like, how are things going? So he gives him his report, and David's like, you should go back home. Enjoy the company of your wife while you're being here. And Uriah's like, I could never do that, good king. He's like, no, you should. He's like, no, I can do that. And David is all of a sudden is staring at someone who is more righteous than him, right? Because remember what the king is supposed to look like. The king is supposed to look like a shepherd that is taking care of the sheep. And here Uriah is. He's like, no, I'm not going to go be with my wife. I'm going to serve you, good king. So David recognizes his problem right there then. Yeah, he's like, Uriah's not drunk enough. So he's like, Uriah, let's eat and drink and be merry, right? And he gets him good and drunk. And Uriah still in the stupor and haze of mind still is righteous enough where he protects King David. David is frustrated beyond like Uriah he is shepherding David in his moment of distress. And finally, David can't have enough, and he brings Uriah up. He brings Uriah up and he gives him a paper. He's like, go give this to Joab, the general on the front lines. And what that letter says is that put Uriah in the company that is on the front lines of the battle, which is basically a death sentence. And I think this is an amazing moment because Uriah has to carry this letter, his letter of his own death sentence, right? His letter of his own sacrifice at the altar of David's power, so that David's sin can be covered up, is carrying that over there. It reminds me of, like, you remember Abraham and Isaac, when God told Abraham to sacrifice his only son Isaac, and they walk up the mountain, and Abraham puts the load for the sacrifice, all the wood and timber on top of Isaac as they walk up there. Like that's like a heavy load of Uriah is carrying, right? And he has no idea. But he's carrying this letter of the sacrifice of himself. It also kind of sounds like Jesus walking through the streets of Jerusalem with the cross on himself. As he walks through carrying the burdens of all of our sin on him as he goes to the place of the skull, to Golgotha and all that. Yeah, so he carries that there, hands it to Joab. Joab puts him on the front lines, and he dies. He dies. David gets away with it, right? Joab sends, like, you can read all about it, but Nathan comes up to David. The prophet Nathan comes up to him and reminds David of something. Because Nathan doesn't come up to him and just go, hey, David, you're a dirty, nasty sinner. You need to turn your ways around. He doesn't do that. He reminds, just like God said to David in chapter 7. He's like, remember where you came from, David. Remember that you were once that shepherd who only had a few sheep. Remember where you came from. And Nathan then begins to tell David a story, because this is what the kings did. They would hear stories and they would enact judgments on them, right? Like, so the king would hear these things, and it's like, oh man, that injustice happened in my kingdom? Yeah, like take this from that person, give it to this person, and they would work it all out. So Nathan is like, hey, there's someone in our kingdom, this rich man who has so many sheep. He's got so many of him around them. And then there was this poor man who had nothing. And this rich man wanted to have a party. He wanted to have this just really awesome party. And he looked at that poor man's one sheep. He looked at his one sheep and he saw it, and he stole that sheep, killed it, and then slaughtered it for his big party. And David, you can imagine what David's feeling like this. He's like, oh man, I remember when I was that poor man. I remember when I only had that one sheep. You know, and he probably named his sheep too. It was probably Barbara or something like that, you know? It's a terrible joke. Don't laugh at stuff like that. The sheep's name. Like that, But you know, he's like, oh, I remember those sheep over there. And what do you mean a rich man, rich man stole that sheep? I remember when I had nothing and what that would have meant to lose all those things. And David gets angry at what Nathan is telling him. He gets angry, and David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. That's a kingly edict. That's an edict from the throne. That man must die, right? Like that man should have capital punishment and all those things. And he must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. It's a kingly edict that he came down casting his own death sentence, because Nathan looks at him. He goes, that's you, David. That's you. That's you. You are this man. And this is what God says. The God of Israel says, I anointed you king over Israel. Do you remember all those times that I saved you from the hand of Saul? That Saul was on murderous rants against you, and I saved you from all of those? Don't you remember that, David? I gave you Saul's house. I gave you Saul's wives into your arms. I gave you all of Judah and Israel. And if that had been too little, I would have given you so much more. I would have given you so much more. Like he's saying, like, you are that rich man. You had so much abundance. What are you doing? Why do you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword. And it's not even that you struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You did it by a backdoor mean. You killed him with the sword of the Amorites. And as I was looking at this story, I was always like, oh my goodness, like this is David, and David is being shown here not as that humble shepherd boy, but as a man who has power of a mighty king and kingdom. A man who has power like a Pharaoh. A man who has power like the king of Babylon or the king of the Philistines or the king of the Amorites with huge crowns on his head. And he's just doing whatever is right in his own eyes. Here is what I want to do. And he's being called out on it. He's like, you came in as this humble servant and you look the exact opposite of it now. And David sees it. He sees the struggle right in his face. He sees the hurt and the pain that has happened here. And David says to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan says back to him, it's like, The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. I've never paid attention to this. The Lord has taken away your sin. You're not going to die. The Lord has forgiven you because there is a Deuteronomy law that says that, you've heard it when Jesus said, you've heard it said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, life for a life type of idea there. But Jesus says, but I say, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Like that's like that Jesus adds on to it. But by the laws of his kingdom, he's supposed to die. Not only that, but he did a kingly edict against himself that basically said, off with his head. And here he is. And Nathan says to him, your sin has been taken away. You're not going to die. You're not going to die. And this is where the story has always ended for me. And it's like, oh, that's good, because we love to have these movements where we go back. It's like mountaintop experience. The Lord has forgiven all of the sins and great things, and we hear this story here, and we can oftentimes put people into David's shoes that we like. We're like, see, that bad thing that they were doing wasn't that bad. Like David did bad things, and the Lord forgave him, right? Like we can do this, and we often do it. Trying to cover up sin because we love the power that David has right now. And but the truth is that sin is there and it has caused pain. Now, some of the pain I've always known about, and you guys all probably know about it too. What happened to the child from David and Bathsheba's relationship there? It died. Yeah, we all know that. And that's as far as I always understood it. It was like, this is just what happened to that child, is that it died, and that's awful, and David kind of goes spiraling down. But it's amazing what happens when you read the Bible, right, Ed? Right? Oh, Gloria was at first service, right? When we read the Bible, we end up finding stuff out. Let's read that. This is just a couple of verses after the baby dies. Oh, this is next one. So David, this is verse 29. David mustered the entire army and went to Rabbah and attacked and captured it. Remember, David is doing whatever is right in his own eyes. Well, he's finally gone. He's like, well, I've seen the error of my ways. He's finally gone to battle, right? He's finally gone to battle. And so he captures this town. And David took the crown from the king's head that he overcame, and it was placed on his own head, and it weighed a talent of gold and had precious stones all around it. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. I didn't know this until this week. All right? How much does a talent of gold weigh in pounds? How much does it weigh? You know. So shh. You know the rules. So does anyone want to guess? 10 pounds? Does anyone else want to guess? It's higher. 15? 75 pounds. 75 pounds. Filled with stones and precious, rubies and all of that around it. And David is sitting there with this massive, gaudy looking, terrible looking crown on his head, filled with power and glory, right? And David took a great quantity of the plunder of the city. You guys ready? It just gets better. Here we go. He's got this massive crown on his head, and he brought out people who were there, consigning them to labor. What does consigning them to labor mean? Sounds like slavery, right? You're kind of forcing people to work. That's just I'm going to pay you a fair wage. I don't think that's what's going on. Consigning them to labor with saws and with iron picks and axes. And I want you to read the word when I stop. And he made them work at... What does that sound like? Sounds like Egypt. Pharaoh. Suddenly David is embodying the full force he was even with the Bathsheba stuff. That he is deciding what happens. I'm going to do what is right in my own eyes. And here we have this king with this massive crown on his head, looking like a pharaoh, looking like the king of Babylon, looking like this king that's all powerful, and he has people making bricks for him. And you look at it and you're like, oh my, how far we've fallen. That's why I began this sermon with reminding us what the midst of our faith is. That it's not built on God came in all this glory. It's not based on that if I can just finally attain and do all the right things, believe all the right stuff, get my neighbors to believe all the right stuff, force people to live the life that I think is good and Christian, then God will save everything. That's not it. Jesus comes through this line of David. Not the David who is great and triumphant. We've got 2 more sermons. And Ed, you've been getting ready for your sermon next week, right? It deals with some cheery matters, right? It's all like puppies and bunnies and rainbows and all that stuff, right? No, like this David doesn't know how to function anymore, and straight up dysfunction go throughout his whole life. And Ed has a history in grief counseling, in trauma counseling, and I think, I'm probably setting it up too much for you, Ed. I think you're the right guy to do next week. I think I would probably just butcher it, just like I'm doing with this sermon right now. But I want you to hear that this is the line that God chose to bring about his Messiah. Because even in that story, I talked about it in the confession, James and John, they came up, we want to be at your right and left in your glory, Jesus. We want to be at your right and left in your glory. And Jesus is like, you guys don't even know what you're asking for. I can't even give that to you. But we see when Jesus was lifted up in his glory, when we see that Jesus was lifted up in his glory, when was that, by the way? When Jesus was lifted up in his glory? The cross. That's the cross. When Jesus was risen up in his glory was the cross. When he was risen, and he had someone on his right and his left. Who were on his right and left in his glory? The thieves. The very bottom of society, right? Almost like David is there as he was stealing sheep from other people, right? The thieves, the bottom of the cross. And what we see that so often in our own lives, we see this rise and fall nature that we think that this is how our Christian life is supposed to be. That it's a rise and yes, I sin some more and I'll rise again, I'll sin some more. But what we see the kingdom of God is like, is it's not a rise and a fall, but it's a fall then a rise. And I think it's a fall and a rise because Jesus isn't leaving anybody out. That no one is lower than the God, the creator of everything, who came into this world. No one is lower than the death of that. Because think about Jesus' death. Jesus' death isn't the highlight of Christian faithfulness. Remember, Peter denied him 3 times. Judas sold him out for some money. All the disciples fled away in fear. The cross is not the moment of the highest point of our own righteousness, and yet that point is the moment of our salvation. The moment of your salvation isn't your high point. It's when you found yourself wanting power like a Pharaoh, wanting to control people and hurt. That's when the Messiah comes. And in 3 days, he rises from the tomb, wiping everything from us so we can be free. This is the most cheery sermon, but I think Easter isn't about whistles and music and makers, that's all part of it. But I think Easter morning, like we come out of the grave with Jesus and we go, I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm okay. And I think that's what David and Bathsheba shows us. And I think that's good news. And we'll end right there. Let's say a prayer. Jesus, we thank you that you are with us, that you're always guiding us. And Lord, when we feel like we need to save ourselves, help us to remember that you came on the cross and that's lower than any of our attempts to save ourselves. And Lord, when we feel like we've done such things that are so heinous that we could never have salvation, Lord, remember that you help us to remember and see you on the cross and see that you have all brought us in like that good shepherd that protects his sheep. Thank you, Jesus, for loving us and saving us. Amen. Thank you so much for listening to that there about David and Bathsheba. It was in Bible study, it rocked my world when we read that. Because I read it with everyone else, because I wouldn't plan ahead in a Bible study. Come on. What do you guys think? I was just like, oh my goodness, David's like a Pharaoh. And we're not